She stood knee-deep in river mud, doing work that had killed men twice her size, invisible to everyone except the cowboy who saw what no one else did, that the woman they'd thrown away possessed a gift worth more than all their judgment combined. His reply would change both their lives. The Montana Territory had a way of stripping people down to what they were truly made of. Out here, where the mountains scraped the underbelly of heaven and the winters could freeze a man's soul before his body, pretense died as quickly as wildflowers in August. What mattered wasn't the color of your skin or the circumstances of your birth. What mattered was what your hands could do and whether your word meant a damn thing. At least, that's what people like to say. Becky James knew better. She stood at the river's edge as the September sun climbed over the eastern peaks, painting the water gold and the timber dark as old blood. Her brown dress was soaked to the knees, heavy with river water and mud. Her boots were men's boots, bought second-hand and 2 sizes too large, squelched with every step. The cant hook in her hands was nearly as tall as she was, its iron point dulled from use and its wooden handle worn smooth by countless hands before hers. None of those hands had been a woman's hands. None of those hands had been black hands. But here she was, 3 weeks into the hardest work she'd ever done, and still standing. "Mama, can I help?" If this story is stirring something in you, don't just scroll on by. Hit that like button. It tells us you still believe in real love, the kind that's honest, not fancy. And I want to hear from you what his words mean to you. Drop your thoughts down in the comments. Sometimes your story can touch someone else's heart too. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. We share stories like this every week about love, loss, and the kind of truth that never grows old. So stick around, partner. Now let's continue the story. Prince's voice carried across the morning air, high and sweet and trying so hard to sound brave. He sat on the wagon bench 20 yards back from the water's edge, his small legs dangling, his hands gripping the worn wood. He was 4 years old, with his mama's dark eyes and his absent father's dimpled chin. He wore a shirt Becky had patched so many times it was more thread than fabric, and pants she'd let down twice that were still too short. "Stay back from the water, baby," Becky called without turning around. She couldn't afford to take her eyes off the massive log wedged against the rocky outcrop in front of her. "You keep watch of our things, all right? That's important work." "Yes, Mama." She could hear the disappointment in his voice, and it cut her deeper than any insult the men at the lumber camp could throw. Prince wanted to help. He wanted to make things easier for her. But he was 4 years old, barely tall enough to reach her waist, and this work could kill a grown man if he wasn't careful. It had killed 2 men just last year, according to the stories. Becky shifted her grip on the cant hook and studied the logjam in front of her. 3 massive ponderosa pines, each one thick as a man's torso, had wedged themselves against the rocks during the spring runoff. The current pushed against them constantly, and smaller debris had piled up behind them. Branches, bark, even a few smaller logs. It was a dam waiting to break, and when it did, it would send a wall of timber and water downstream that could destroy the company's entire operation. This was why Foreman Dalton had assigned her to clear it. Not because he trusted her to do the job. Not because he thought she was capable. But because if she got hurt or killed trying, well, that would solve his other problem, namely, that a black woman with no husband had the audacity to show up every day asking for work. Becky had understood all of this when he'd given her the assignment yesterday evening. She'd seen it in his smirk, heard it in the laughter of the other workers. She'd felt it in her bones the way she felt the coming winter in her bad shoulder. But she'd also seen the $2 he'd offered. $2 would buy flour, beans, salt pork, and lamp oil. $2 would pay the lease on their cabin for another month. $2 would mean Prince wouldn't have to watch her water down the soup again to make it stretch another day. So she'd said yes. She'd gone home to their one-room cabin, held Prince while he slept, and prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. Then she'd woken before dawn, fed Prince a breakfast of cornmeal mush and old molasses, and brought him here because she had no one to watch him and couldn't afford to pay someone even if she did. Now, as the sun climbed higher and the other workers began to arrive at the camp downstream, Becky positioned herself at what she hoped was the right angle. She'd walked around the jam 3 times already, studying it from every direction, trying to understand which log was the key, the one that, if moved, would let the whole thing break free without crushing her in the process. She thought she'd found it. A slightly smaller pine on the left side, wedged at an angle. If she could work it loose, the current should do the rest. Should. Probably. Maybe. Lord, if you're listening, she whispered, I could use a little help here. She set the cant hook's iron point against the bark, found her leverage, and pulled. The wood didn't budge. She reset her grip, planted her feet more firmly in the mud, and pulled again. Her shoulders screamed in protest. Her hands, already calloused and cracked from 3 weeks of brutal work, felt like they were on fire. But the log shifted just an inch, but it moved. That's it, she breathed. Come on now. She pulled again, throwing all her weight and strength into it. The log groaned and shifted another few inches. The water current caught it, adding its force to hers, and suddenly the log swung free with a crack that echoed off the mountain walls. Becky stumbled backward, losing her grip on the cant hook. She landed hard on her backside in the mud just as the jam broke. The sound was like thunder, timber crashing against timber, water rushing free, the whole mass of logs and debris tumbling downstream in a chaos of spray and splinters. She scrambled backward on her hands and feet, getting clear just as a piece of debris the size of her torso went spinning past where she'd been standing. And then it was over. The water ran clear and fast. The rocks stood bare. The jam was gone, swept downstream where it would be someone else's problem or, more likely, would break apart in the current and wash up on the banks where it could be harvested safely. Becky sat in the mud, breathing hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her hands were shaking. Her dress was ruined, not that it hadn't been ruined already. And she'd lost the cant hook in the chaos, which meant Dalton would probably charge her for it. But she was alive. Mama. Mama, you did it. Prince was running toward her, his face lit up with joy and pride. She wanted to scold him for leaving the wagon, but she couldn't find the words. Instead, she opened her arms and let him crash into her, his small body warm and solid against hers. I knew you could do it, he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. I knew it, Mama. Of course I did, baby, she said, holding him tight. Your mama doesn't quit. She didn't add that she'd been terrified. She didn't tell him that she'd been certain, at least twice, that she was about to die. She didn't explain that the only reason she'd taken this insane risk was because they were down to their last handful of cornmeal and she couldn't bear to watch him go hungry again. Those were burdens a child shouldn't have to carry. Now go on back to the wagon, she said, gently pushing him away. Let me find that cant hook before Foreman Dalton gets here. Prince scampered back to safety, and Becky pushed herself to her feet. Everything hurt her back, her shoulders, her hands, her pride. But she was standing, and the job was done, and that meant she'd get paid. She was wading into the shallows, searching for the cant hook, when she heard boots on gravel behind her. Well, I'll be damned. Becky's back went rigid. She knew that voice, Foreman Dalton, arriving early to see if she'd managed to get herself killed. She turned slowly, wiping her muddy hands on her even muddier dress. Dalton stood on the bank with 3 other men flanking him. He was a thick-necked bull of a man with a red face and small, mean eyes. The other men, Pete, Johnson, and a new fellow whose name she didn't know, looked equally surprised. "You actually did it," Dalton said, his tone somewhere between impressed and annoyed. "Yes, sir," Becky said quietly. "Job's done. The jam's cleared." Dalton walked to the water's edge and looked upstream, then downstream. He kicked at a piece of bark that had washed up on the rocks. The other men followed, studying her work with expressions she couldn't quite read. "Hey," Dalton finally said. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He counted out coins with deliberate slowness, $1, $2, then tossed them into the mud at her feet. Becky stared at the coins glinting in the muck. "Well," Dalton said, "you want your pay or not?" She wanted to tell him what she thought of a man who'd throw money in the mud like she was a dog begging for scraps. She wanted to tell him that she'd done in 3 hours what he claimed would take all day, that she'd done it with more skill and precision than any of his regular workers could have managed. But she had Prince to think about, and rent to pay, and food to buy. So she bent down, picked up the coins, and wiped them clean on her dress. "Thank you, sir," she said, the words tasting like ashes. Dalton smirked. "Don't spend it all in one place, gal." He turned to his men. "Come on. Let's get to work. Real work, not whatever that was." The men followed him downstream, their laughter carrying back to her on the morning breeze. Becky stood there, holding the $2 she'd almost died for, and felt something hot and painful twist in her chest. It wasn't the first time she'd been humiliated. It wouldn't be the last. Out here, humiliation was just another kind of weather, something you endured because you had no other choice. She pocketed the coins and went back to searching for the cant hook. She found it wedged between 2 rocks downstream, its handle cracked but still usable. As she pulled it free, she caught sight of her reflection in the water. A black woman, 30 years old, looking 40. Clothes hanging on a frame that had once been fuller, stronger. Hair tied back with a piece of string because she couldn't afford ribbon. Hands that bore the scars and calluses of hard labor, not the refined work she'd been trained to do. This is what the world sees, she thought. This is all they let themselves see. "Mama, can we go to town now?" Prince had appeared beside her again, his eyes hopeful. Town meant the general store, and the general store sometimes meant a peppermint stick if they had a little extra money. Which they didn't, but she couldn't bear to crush that hope in his eyes. "Yes, baby," she said, taking his hand. "Let's go to town." They loaded the cant hook into Becky's wagon, bought with money saved over 6 months of taking in washing, the single piece of property she owned in this world besides the clothes on their backs and the few items in their cabin. Prince climbed up onto the bench beside her, and she clucked to the old mule that pulled it. The lumber camp was coming to life now. Men shouted to each other, making ready for the day's work. The sound of axes biting into wood echoed across the water. Smoke rose from the cook shack where breakfast was being prepared. Not one of those men acknowledged her as she drove past. She was invisible to them unless they needed someone to do a job too dangerous or degrading for their taste. Then suddenly she became visible, became useful, became entertainment. The ride into Helena took an hour. The town sat in a valley surrounded by mountains, a collection of wood frame buildings and muddy streets that served the mining and timber operations scattered throughout the territory. It had been a boom town once, back when gold was still plentiful. Now it was just another frontier settlement trying to survive the slow decline of the easy riches. Becky drove straight to the general store, acutely aware of the stares that followed her. The white women on the boardwalk gathered their skirts a little tighter as she passed, as if poverty and single motherhood might be contagious. The men looked through her, around her, anywhere but at her. Only the children stared openly, their young faces full of curiosity before their parents pulled them away with whispered admonishments. She tied the mule outside the store and lifted Prince down from the wagon. "Remember," she told him quietly, "we're here for supplies. Flour, beans, salt pork if they have it. Nothing else." "Yes, Mama." But she could see him looking at the penny candy display in the window, and her heart broke a little more. The store was dim and cool after the brightness outside. Mr. Hendricks, the proprietor, looked up from his ledger as they entered. His expression went carefully neutral, not welcoming, not hostile, just blank. "Miss James," he said. It wasn't a greeting so much as an acknowledgement of her presence. "Mr. Hendricks," she replied. "I need to purchase some supplies." She placed her list on the counter, carefully written in her neat hand, because her father had taught her that literacy was power even when people tried to take everything else away. Hendricks looked at the list, then at her, then at the coins she counted out onto the scarred wood. "Flour's gone up," he said. 5 cents more per pound. Of course it had. It always went up when she was the one buying. "That's fine," she said, though it wasn't fine at all. She recalculated quickly in her head, striking items off her mental list. No salt pork this week. No lamp oil either. They'd make do with candles. While Hendricks gathered her supplies, Becky felt eyes on her back. She turned slightly and saw Mrs. Henderson standing near the fabric display with her daughter, the same Mrs. Henderson who'd pulled her child away from Prince at church. The woman's face was pinched with distaste, as if Becky's mere presence was an affront. Becky turned back to the counter, her jaw tight. "Here you are," Hendricks said, setting her parcels on the counter. "That'll be $1.87. She counted out the money carefully. That left her with 13 cents, enough for the cabin lease, which was 25 cents a week, if she could find another job in the next 3 days. If not, well, she'd worry about that when the time came. "Thank you," she said, gathering the parcels. "Mama," Prince whispered, tugging on her sleeve. "Can I?" "No, baby," she said gently but firmly. "Not today." His face fell, but he didn't argue. He never did. At 4 years old, he already understood that their lives ran on narrow margins and there was no room for wants, only needs. They were almost to the door when it opened and a man stepped through. He was tall, weathered, with sun-darkened skin and a scar along his jaw. He wore the rough clothes of a working man: canvas pants, a faded shirt, sturdy boots. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow. He stepped aside to let them pass, and for just a moment, his eyes met Becky's. They were dark eyes, watchful eyes, the eyes of someone who'd seen too much and trusted too little. But there was something else in them too, a flicker of recognition, though she was certain they'd never met. He said, tipping his hat slightly. Becky nodded, too surprised to speak. White men in Montana Territory didn't tip their hats to black women. They didn't acknowledge them as They didn't meet their eyes with anything resembling respect. But this man had, and then he was past her, moving deeper into the store, and she was left standing in the doorway wondering if she'd imagined it. "Who was that, Mama?" Prince asked as they loaded the supplies into the wagon. "I don't know, baby," she said. "Just a stranger passing through." But as she drove the wagon back toward their cabin on the outskirts of town, She found herself thinking about those dark eyes and that small gesture of respect. It had been so long since anyone had treated her like a person, like someone worthy of basic courtesy, that the moment felt almost unreal. The cabin came into view, a small, rough structure at the end of a rutted path, surrounded by pine trees and overlooking a creek. It wasn't much. One room with a fireplace, a table she'd built herself, 2 chairs, a bed for her and a smaller pallet for Prince. But it was theirs, at least for as long as she could keep paying the lease. She unhitched the mule and turned him loose in the small paddock behind the cabin. Prince helped carry the supplies inside, his small arms straining under the weight of the flour sack. "Good job, baby," she said, ruffling his hair. "Why don't you go play by the creek for a while? But stay where I can see you." "Yes, Mama." As Prince ran outside, Becky stood in the dim cabin and let herself feel, just for a moment, the weight of everything she carried. The exhaustion, the fear, the constant, grinding pressure of trying to survive in a world that had decided she didn't deserve to. She'd been Rebecca Josephine James, once the daughter of a successful carpenter, a skilled craftswoman in her own right, a young woman with prospects and a future. Her father had owned property in Philadelphia, had built a business through skill and determination, had taught her everything he knew about woodworking and construction. "You've got a gift, Becca," he used to say, his large hands guiding hers as she learned to read the grain of wood, to calculate angles, to understand the geometry of construction. "A real gift. Don't let nobody tell you what you can't do." She'd believed him. She'd spent her teenage years apprenticing with him, learning not just the craft but the business. She'd drawn plans for furniture, calculated costs, negotiated with suppliers. By the time she was 16, she could design and build pieces that rivaled anything in the fancy shops downtown. And then Thomas had arrived. Thomas with his easy smile and his promises of adventure. Thomas who'd made her believe that love was enough to build a life on. Thomas who'd talked about the West like it was some kind of paradise where two people in love could start fresh, away from the constraints and judgments of Philadelphia society. She'd been 19 and foolish enough to believe him. They'd traveled west together, married by a circuit preacher in Ohio. For a few months, it had been everything he'd promised: an adventure, a romance, a new beginning. They'd reached Montana territory just as winter was setting in, and Thomas had found work with the railroad. Then spring came, and so did the news that she was pregnant. Thomas had looked at her differently after that. The easy smiles became rare. The promises of their future together became vague, conditional. And then, one morning in May, she'd woken to find him gone: his clothes, his money, everything. Just gone, leaving behind only a note that said he wasn't ready to be a father. 2 months later, word reached her that her father had died back in Philadelphia. Heart failure, the letter said. The business had been sold to pay his debts she'd never known existed. There was nothing left. No inheritance, no property, no family. She'd been alone in Montana territory, 6 months pregnant, with $30 to her name and no skills that anyone wanted from a black woman. So she'd done washing. She'd done mending. She'd cleaned houses and scrubbed floors and taken any work that was offered, no matter how degrading. She'd given birth to Prince in a small room above a saloon, attended by a Chinese woman who spoke almost no English but had kind hands and knew her business. And she'd survived. She'd kept her carpentry skills hidden because there was no point in revealing them. No one would hire her to do that kind of work. No one would take her seriously. Her gift, as her father had called it, had become just another thing she'd lost along the way. Becky walked to the window and watched Prince playing by the creek, his small figure silhouetted against the water. He was building something with sticks and stones, his face scrunched in concentration. He had her father's hands, she realized. The same clever, capable hands. "I'll find a way," she whispered to the empty cabin. "I'll find a way to give you better than this." But even as she said it, she felt the weight of impossibility pressing down on her shoulders. What way was there? What path existed for a black woman alone with a child in a territory that had already decided she was worthless? She didn't have an answer. But she had 13 cents, a bag of flour, and another day of survival ahead of her. For now, that would have to be enough. Diego Lopez had learned a long time ago that trouble had a particular smell to it, like copper and fear, with an undertone of desperation. He'd smelled it the moment he walked into the lumber camp 4 weeks ago, had watched it crystallize around the black woman working jobs that should have killed her by now. He'd seen a lot of injustice in his 32 years. Hell, he'd participated in some of it, back when he was younger and stupider and thought the world made sense according to rules that actually mattered. Texas had beaten that notion out of him, along with any illusions he'd had about justice or fairness or the idea that good people automatically got what they deserved. But watching Becky James break that logjam this morning had stirred something in him he'd thought was long dead, a sense of righteous anger, maybe, or just recognition. Recognition of what it looked like when someone was being ground down by a world that had decided they didn't deserve better. He knew what that looked like because he'd lived it himself. Now, as the sun climbed toward noon and the lumber camp settled into its daily rhythm of back-breaking work and casual cruelty, Diego stood apart from the other workers and made a decision that would probably complicate his life considerably. He was going to help her. Not because he was looking for redemption. He'd stopped believing in that particular fairy tale years ago. Not because he thought one good deed would somehow balance the scales of his past. But because he was tired. Tired of watching people with power use it to crush people without. Tired of being the kind of man who saw injustice and looked away because it was easier, safer, smarter. Tired of running. Lopez. Diego turned to see Foreman Dalton approaching, his thick neck red with exertion or anger or both. Behind him trailed Pete and Johnson, Dalton's favorite toadies, men who'd sold whatever decency they might have once possessed for the privilege of feeling superior to someone. "Yeah," Diego said, his tone carefully neutral. "You seen that black gal do that jam this morning?" "I saw it." Dalton shook his head, half laughing. "Damnedest thing. Thought for sure she'd get herself killed. Save me the trouble of firing her." He spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "But she's persistent, I'll give her that. Like a dog that don't know when to quit." Diego felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his expression blank. "She did the job." "That she did," Dalton agreed. "Which means I got to find her another one. Can't have her thinking she's proved something." He studied Diego with narrow eyes. "You got any problem with that?" It was a test. Diego recognized it immediately. Dalton was gauging where Diego's loyalties lay, whether he was going to be trouble or just another worker keeping his head down and collecting his pay. "Not my business who you hire or what you have them do," Diego said with a shrug. "I'm just here to work." "Good." Dalton smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Because I got a real job for you. There's another jam upriver, bigger than the one I sent the gal to handle. Gonna need 3, maybe 4 men to clear it safely. You interested?" "How much?" $2. Diego did the math quickly. $2 split 4 ways was 50 cents each, exactly what Dalton had originally offered Becky for work that was just as dangerous. The man was consistent in his exploitation. At least. "When?" Diego asked. Tomorrow morning, first light. I'll need you and 3 others. Your choice who? Diego nodded. I'll do it. Good man. Dalton clapped him on the shoulder with false camaraderie. See? This is what I like about you, Lopez. You know your place. You do the work, collect your pay, don't cause trouble. Wish more folks around here had that attitude. He walked away, laughing with his toadies about something Diego didn't bother to listen to. Your place. Diego had heard those words before, in different contexts, from different mouths. In Texas, they'd meant one thing. Here in Montana, they meant another. But the fundamental message was always the same. Stay small, stay quiet, stay grateful for whatever scraps the powerful chose to throw you. He'd followed that advice for years, moving from place to place, never staying long enough to form attachments or accumulate enemies. Never standing out. Never being memorable. But something about this place, this situation, this woman fighting so hard just to survive it had gotten under his skin. Diego spent the rest of the day working the river drive, helping guide logs downstream to where they'd be collected and processed. It was hard, dangerous work that required constant attention. One mistake and you could be crushed between logs or dragged under by the current. He'd seen it happen to men who got careless or unlucky. But his mind wasn't fully on the work. Part of it was occupied with planning, calculating, trying to figure out the best way to approach Becky James with an offer that wouldn't insult her pride or make her suspicious of his motives. Because he knew what women in her position learned fast, that men who offered help usually wanted something in return, and that something was rarely innocent. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Diego cleaned up at the water pump and headed into town. Helena was busy with the day's end traffic, miners and loggers finishing their shifts, merchants closing their shops, women hurrying home to prepare supper. He walked with purpose but without hurry, his eyes constantly scanning his surroundings. Old habits. In Texas, vigilance had kept him alive. Here, it was probably unnecessary, but habits carved by necessity were hard to break. The general store was still open, and Diego went inside with a clear mission. Hendricks looked up from his ledger, his expression neutral. "Help you?" the proprietor asked. "Need to buy some supplies," Diego said. "Flour, beans, salt pork, lamp oil, and some peppermint sticks." Hendricks raised an eyebrow at the last item but said nothing. As he gathered the supplies, Diego counted out the money, almost a week's wages, which would leave him with barely enough for his own needs. But he had a plan forming, and it required an investment. Delivering these somewhere? Hendricks asked as he wrapped the parcels. "Might be," Diego said non-committally. Hendricks studied him for a moment, then shrugged. Not his business, apparently. Diego paid, collected his parcels, and left before anyone could ask more questions. The cabin where Becky lived was easy to find. He'd followed her wagon that morning, keeping his distance, just making sure she and the boy got home safely. It sat at the end of a rutted path, small and rough but well maintained. Smoke rose from the chimney, and he could hear the sound of a child's voice singing something off-key. Diego approached slowly, not wanting to startle anyone. When he was still 20 yards out, the door opened and Becky stepped onto the small porch. She was holding a rifle, old but well kept, pointed at the ground but ready. "That's far enough," she called out. Diego stopped, impressed despite himself. Most people wouldn't have heard him coming. But she'd been alert, prepared, ready to defend herself and her child. He said, setting the parcels down on the ground and stepping back with his hands visible. "I'm not here to cause trouble." Then state your business and move on. I'm Diego Lopez. I work at the lumber camp. I know who you are, Becky said. Her voice was steady, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. I've seen you watching me. Of course she had. She was observant, she'd have to be, to survive what she was surviving. I wanted to talk to you about the job Dalton assigned you this morning, Diego said. The log jam. I did the job. Got paid. That's the end of it. He's planning to give you another one, Diego said. Tomorrow. Even more dangerous than today's. Becky's expression didn't change, but her grip on the rifle tightened slightly. How do you know that? Because he just offered me the same job, said it would take 4 men to do it safely. He's going to offer you half the pay and expect you to do it alone. For a long moment, Becky said nothing. Diego could see her thinking, calculating, trying to decide if he was telling the truth or setting some kind of trap. Why are you telling me this? She finally asked. Because it's wrong, Diego said simply. And because I'm tired of watching wrong things happen and doing nothing about it. Lot of wrong things in this world, Becky said. You can't fix them all. No, Diego agreed. But maybe I can fix this one. How? By helping you with the job. We do it together, split the pay fairly, make sure neither of us gets killed in the process. Becky laughed, but there was no humor in it. And what do you want in return? Nothing you're not willing to give. Men always want something. Not this man, Diego said. Not from you. She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for deception, for hidden motives, for whatever trap she was certain must be there. I brought supplies, Diego said, gesturing to the parcels on the ground. Flour, beans, lamp oil. Some candy for your boy. Not payment, not a trade. Just. He struggled to find the right words. Just evening the odds a little. I don't accept charity, Becky said firmly. It's not charity. It's an investment. In what? In making sure someone with actual skill doesn't get killed doing a job that's beneath her capabilities. Becky's eyes narrowed. What do you mean by that? Diego took a careful breath. This was the gamble, the moment where he either earned her trust or confirmed her worst suspicions about his motives. I've been watching you work for 2 weeks, he said. I've seen how you study a problem before you tackle it. How you calculate angles and leverage points. How you read wood grain and structural integrity. That's not the work of someone who learned on the job. That's trained skill. Real training. You don't know anything about me, Becky said, but her voice had lost some of its hardness. I know enough, Diego replied. I know you're doing work you're overqualified for because nobody's willing to see past what you look like. I know you're protecting something, probably your boy's future. And I know that if Dalton gets his way, you'll be dead by the end of the week and he'll call it an unfortunate accident. So you're offering to save me. There was bitterness in her voice now. Another white man riding to the rescue. No, Diego said firmly. I'm offering to work with you. Partner with you. Use both our skills to do the job safely and get paid fairly for it. That's all. You haven't told me what you get out of this arrangement. Diego considered his answer carefully. Peace of mind. Maybe. The ability to look at myself in a mirror without feeling like a coward. The chance to do something right for once in my life. He paused. And maybe someone to watch my back, because I've got my own reasons for not wanting to die on a riverbank in Montana. Something in Becky's posture shifted slightly. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the possibility of it. "Prince," she called over her shoulder. "Stay inside, baby." "Yes, Mama," came the small voice from within the cabin. Becky stepped down from the porch, the rifle still in her hands but no longer quite so ready. She approached Diego slowly, stopping a few feet away to study him more closely. "You said you work at the camp," she said. "But you're not like the other men there." "How so?" "They treat their work like punishment. You treat it like something you're trying to forget." Diego felt a cold finger of recognition trace down his spine. She was more perceptive than he'd realized. "Maybe I am," he admitted. "What are you running from, Mr. Lopez?" "Same thing most folks out here are running from," he said. "A past that won't stay buried. That makes you dangerous. To some people, maybe. Not to you." Becky looked at him for another long moment, then down at the parcels on the ground, then back at him. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "we do it my way. I make the plans, I call the shots, and we split everything 50-50. Not 60-40 because you're a man, not 70-30 because you're white. 50-50, equal partners." "Agreed," Diego said without hesitation. "And if you try anything inappropriate with me, I'll shoot you. I'm a good shot, Mr. Lopez. My father made sure of that." "Understood. And you don't come around my boy unless I invite you. He's been through enough. He doesn't need confusion about who's in his life and who's not." "Fair enough." Becky seemed to be weighing something internally, some calculation Diego couldn't follow. Finally, she lowered the rifle completely. "All right," she said. "We'll try it your way. One job. If it works, maybe we talk about doing it again. If it doesn't..." She shrugged. "Well, I guess we'll both be dead, so it won't matter much." Diego felt something loosen in his chest, tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "One job," he agreed. "We meet at the camp at dawn. I'll bring proper equipment, cant hooks, ropes, whatever we need. You bring your knowledge of how to use it." "I can do that." Diego nodded, then started to turn away before stopping. "The supplies," he said, gesturing to the parcels. "I already paid for them. They'll just rot if nobody uses them. Seems wasteful." Becky's lips twitched, almost but not quite a smile. "Fine," she said. "But I'm keeping track. When I get back on my feet, I pay you back." "When you get back on your feet," Diego agreed, knowing she'd never let herself be in anyone's debt. "Fair enough." He started to walk away, then heard her voice call after him. "Mr. Lopez." He turned back. "Why did you tip your hat to me? At the general store this morning?" Diego thought about the question, about all the complicated reasons and simple ones, about respect and recognition and seeing someone truly for what they were instead of what the world had decided they should be. "Because you're a woman who deserves respect," he said simply. Seemed like the right thing to do. For the first time since he'd approached the cabin, Becky's expression softened slightly. "Nobody's tipped their hat to me in 5 years," she said quietly. "Not since I came to this territory." "Then Montana's been full of fools for 5 years," Diego replied. This time, she did smile, small and brief, but real. "Dawn," she said. "Don't be late." "Wouldn't dream of it." As Diego walked back down the rutted path toward town, He felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond simple survival. He'd made a promise to a woman who had every reason not to trust him, and he intended to keep it. Not for redemption. Not for absolution. But because it was the right thing to do, and he'd gone too long doing things that were merely expedient. Behind him, he heard the cabin door close and the sound of a small boy's excited voice asking about the peppermint sticks. He smiled to himself and kept walking. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, at least, he'd done something that didn't make him ashamed to be alive. It was a start. Back at the cabin, Becky stood by the window and watched Diego Lopez disappear down the path. Prince was already tearing into the peppermint sticks with the kind of joy only a 4-year-old could muster over something so simple. "Mama, can I really have one?" he asked, his eyes wide. "Yes, baby," she said. "But just one tonight. We'll save the rest for special occasions." She turned her attention to the other supplies: flour, beans, lamp oil, salt pork. More than she'd been able to buy that morning, enough to last them through the week if she was careful. An investment, he'd called it. Becky didn't trust investments. In her experience, people who invested expected returns, and the returns they expected from women in her position were rarely innocent. But Diego Lopez hadn't looked at her the way men usually did when they were calculating what they could take. He'd looked at her the way her father used to look at a piece of fine wood, with appreciation for what it actually was, not disappointment that it wasn't something else. "Mama, who was that man?" Prince asked around his peppermint stick. "Just someone from the lumber camp, baby." "Is he nice?" Becky thought about that question. Nice was a word children used because they didn't yet understand that the world was more complicated than nice and mean, good and bad. "I think," she said carefully, "that he might be honest. And honest is better than nice." Prince considered this with the seriousness of a child who'd learned young that words had weight and meaning. "I like honest," he decided. "Me too, baby," Becky said, pulling him close. "Me too." That night, after Prince had fallen asleep on his pallet and the cabin was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace, Becky sat at the table and thought about the choice she'd made. She'd agreed to work with a stranger, a man with secrets and a past he was running from. She'd agreed to trust him with her life, quite literally, on a job that could easily kill them both. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It went against every survival instinct she developed over 5 years of learning to trust no one and expect nothing. But it was also the first time in those 5 years that someone had looked at her and seen capabilities instead of limitations. The first time someone had offered partnership instead of charity or exploitation. And maybe, just maybe, it was the first step toward something she'd almost given up on: the possibility that her life could be more than just survival, that her skills could be used for something beyond the jobs nobody else wanted, that her son could grow up seeing his mother as someone with value instead of someone the world had thrown away. "An investment," she murmured to the darkness. Tomorrow would reveal whether Diego Lopez was a fool, a liar, or something else entirely. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, Becky James went to bed with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Dawn came cold and sharp to the Montana Territory, painting the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose. Becky was already awake. She'd barely slept, her mind turning over possibilities and dangers like stones in a creek bed. She'd risen in the dark, built up the fire, and prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of their molasses. Prince still slept on his pallet, one small hand curled beneath his chin, his breathing soft and even. Becky watched him for a moment, memorizing the peaceful lines of his face. If things went wrong today, if the job killed her as it had killed others, At least she'd have this memory to carry with her into whatever came next. She pushed the thought away. Morbid thinking helped no one. She dressed in her sturdiest clothes, the brown dress that was already ruined from yesterday's work, men's boots, and a canvas coat that had belonged to Thomas before he'd abandoned them. She braided her hair tightly and wrapped it in a cloth, then checked the supplies she'd prepared the night before: rope she'd braided herself from hemp fiber, a leather tool belt she'd made years ago in Philadelphia, and a small notebook where she'd sketched out her observations of the logjam from yesterday. Most people thought lumber work was just brute force and luck. They were wrong. It was mathematics and physics, angles and leverage, understanding the properties of wood and water and how they interacted under stress. Her father had taught her all of it, and she'd never forgotten. Mama. She turned to find Prince sitting up on his pallet, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Good morning, baby," she said, going to him and pressing a kiss to his forehead. "I made you breakfast, but I need you to do something very important for me today." "What, Mama?" "I need you to stay with Mrs. Chen." Prince's face fell. Mrs. Chen was the Chinese woman who ran a small laundry on the edge of Helena. She'd helped deliver Prince and had remained one of the few people in town who showed Becky any kindness. But her small rooms were cramped and dark, and Prince always came home smelling of lye soap and disappointment. "I want to come with you," he said. "I know, baby. But this job is more dangerous than yesterday's. I can't do it right if I'm worried about you." She cupped his face in her hands. "You understand?" He nodded, though his lower lip trembled slightly. "Will you come get me after?" "Soon as the job's done," she promised. "And when I do, maybe we'll have enough money to buy you a real coat for winter. One that fits." His eyes brightened at that. "With buttons?" "With buttons," she confirmed, though she had no idea if they'd be able to afford such a thing. She fed him breakfast, helped him dress, and loaded him into the wagon. The ride to Mrs. Chen's took 20 minutes through the quiet morning streets. Most of Helena was still sleeping off the previous night's drinking or preparing for another day of backbreaking work. Mrs. Chen answered the door before Becky could knock. She was always awake early, already hard at work on the endless piles of laundry that kept her business alive. "Becky," she said, her English heavily accented but clear. "You bring Prince." "I have dangerous work today," Becky explained. "Could you watch him? I can pay." "No pay," Mrs. Chen interrupted firmly. "He's a good boy. He helped me fold. Come, Prince." Prince looked back at his mother uncertainly, but Becky nodded encouragingly. "Be good," she told him. "Listen to Mrs. Chen." "Yes, Mama." As Becky turned to leave, Mrs. Chen caught her arm. "You be careful," she said, her dark eyes serious. "Too many people already think you're worth nothing. Don't prove them right by dying." "I'll be careful," Becky promised. "And this man you work with," Mrs. Chen continued. "This Lopez. You trust him?" Becky hesitated. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not really. But something in Diego's eyes yesterday had seemed genuine, and she'd learned to read people out of sheer necessity. "I'm going to find out," she said finally. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "Good. You smart woman. You use that smartness today." "I will." The lumber camp was just coming to life when Becky arrived. Men stumbled from the bunkhouses, heading to the cook shack for breakfast or straight to the river to begin the day's work. A few of them noticed her arrival, Pete particularly, who nudged Johnson and said something that made them both laugh. Becky ignored them. She'd had plenty of practice ignoring things. Diego was waiting by the equipment shed, exactly where he'd said he'd be. He'd clearly been there a while. He'd already assembled a collection of tools and supplies. Cant hooks, rope, a pair of long poles called peavies, and what looked like a block and tackle system. "Morning," he said as she approached. His voice was neutral, professional, as if this were just another day's work with another partner. "Morning," she replied, studying the equipment. "You brought a lot of gear." "The jam Dalton wants us to clear is bigger than yesterday's," Diego said. "I scouted it last night. 6 logs, maybe 7, all jammed against a rock formation about half a mile upriver. The current's strong there, and the bank's steep. It's going to take planning and proper equipment to do it safely." Becky felt a small surge of respect. He'd done reconnaissance, prepared properly, thought ahead. These weren't the actions of someone looking to get them both killed for a quick payout. "Show me your notes," she said. Diego pulled a piece of paper from his pocket, rough sketches of the jam from multiple angles, with measurements and observations written in surprisingly neat handwriting. Becky studied them carefully, comparing them to her own mental calculations. "You think the key log is this one?" she asked, pointing to a log he'd marked in darker pencil. "That'd be my guess," Diego said. "Move that one. The rest should follow. But the angle's tricky. If we don't do it right, the whole thing could shift toward us instead of downstream." "We'll need to set up a pulley system," Becky said, thinking aloud. "Anchor it to that boulder there. Use the block and tackle to control the direction of movement. And we'll need someone in the water with a peavy to guide it as it breaks." "That someone would be me," Diego said. "You're lighter. You should work the pulley from the bank where it's safer." Becky looked at him sharply. "I can handle the water work." "I know you can," Diego said calmly. "But this isn't about capability. It's about smart deployment of resources. If that jam breaks wrong and catches one of us, better it's the person who weighs more and has a better chance of not getting swept downstream. That's me." It was logical, practical, and completely free of condescension. Becky hated that he was right. "Fine," she said. "But I'm directing the operation. You follow my signals exactly, no improvising." "Wouldn't dream of it," Diego replied. "You're the engineer on this job." The rope around Becky's waist went taut, jerking them both to a stop. The current tried to tear them apart, but she held on with everything she had. "Pull," she gasped, though there was no one to hear her. "Pull yourself up the rope." Together, they fought their way back toward the bank, hand over hand along the rope. It took every ounce of strength Becky possessed, and she could feel Diego's grip weakening as the cold worked its way into his muscles. But they made it. They collapsed on the bank, both of them coughing up river water, shaking with cold and exhaustion and adrenaline. "You stupid, stupid man," Becky gasped out between coughs. "I told you to run." "Couldn't," Diego managed. "Would have hit you instead." Becky stared at him, water streaming from her hair, her dress plastered to her body. "What?" "The log," Diego said, still struggling to catch his breath. "If I'd run, it would have swung wide, hit the pulley system where you were standing." Slowly, Becky realized what he was saying. He hadn't stayed in the water out of foolishness or misplaced heroism. He'd calculated the angles, understood the physics, and made a split-second decision to redirect the danger away from her even if it meant putting himself at greater risk. "You're an idiot," she said, but her voice broke on the words. "Yeah," Diego agreed. "But we're both alive, and the jam's cleared. I call that a win." Despite everything, the cold, the fear, the near-death experience, Becky found herself laughing. It was a slightly hysterical sound, born of relief and exhaustion and the sheer absurdity of being alive when they probably shouldn't be. Diego started laughing too, and for a moment they just lay there on the muddy bank, two people who'd nearly died together, laughing at the mountain sky. "We should get back," Becky finally said, pushing herself into a sitting position, "before we freeze to death after surviving drowning." "Solid plan," Diego agreed. They gathered their equipment. Most of it had survived, though one of the cant hooks was gone, swept downstream with the logs. The skiff was still where they'd beached it, which felt like a small miracle. As they poled back toward the lumber camp, Becky found herself studying Diego with new eyes. He'd nearly died protecting her, and he'd done it without hesitation, without expecting thanks or recognition. "Why'd you really do it?" she asked. "Stay in the water like that?" Diego was quiet for a moment, his hand steady on the pole. "Few years back, in Texas, I watched a man die because I chose the safe option instead of the right one. I swore I wouldn't make that choice again." "What happened in Texas?" "That," Diego said, "is a longer story. One for another time, maybe." Becky nodded, understanding. Everyone in the Montana Territory had a past they were running from or trying to forget. Diego's was his own business until he chose to share it. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for what you did back there." "Partners," Diego replied simply. "That's what we agreed. Partners watch out for each other." Partners. The word settled into Becky's chest, warm and solid and strange. She'd been alone for so long, fighting every battle by herself, that the idea of partnership felt almost foreign. But she was starting to think she could get used to it. The lumber camp came into view, and with it, Foreman Dalton and a crowd of workers gathered on the bank. Word had spread about the job, probably Pete or Johnson betting on when the gal and the Mexican would wash up dead. Their expressions when they saw Becky and Diego alive and the jam cleared was almost worth the near-death experience. Almost. Dalton met them at the dock, his face an interesting shade of red. "You actually did it," he said, his tone somewhere between impressed and angry. "Job's done," Becky said, her voice steady despite the cold and exhaustion. "We'll take our payment now." "Payment?" Dalton sputtered. "I said $2 for the job." "You said $2 to Lopez for a job that would take 4 men," Becky interrupted. Her father had taught her never to let people cheat her out of fair payment. "We did the work of 4 men. That's $8. Now wait just a goddamn minute." "Or," Diego said quietly, "we could tell everyone here that you deliberately sent a woman to do a job you knew would kill her, for a fraction of fair wages. Wonder what the territory marshal would think about that." The crowd had gone very quiet. Several of the workers were looking at Dalton with expressions that weren't friendly. Apparently, trying to murder a woman for entertainment didn't sit well even with men who'd spent weeks mocking her. Dalton's face went from red to purple. "Fine," he spat. $8. But you're both fired. Don't come back to this camp." "Gladly," Becky said. Dalton threw the money on the ground again with the throwing money in the dirt, as if he couldn't help but try to humiliate them even in defeat. But this time, Diego picked it up before Becky could. "I got it," he said quietly. He brushed the coins clean and handed them to her with something approaching ceremony. $4 each, as agreed. Becky took the money, feeling the weight of it in her palm. $4. More money than she'd made in a month of taking in washing. "Thank you," she said. As they walked away from the camp, equipment loaded in the skiff, Becky heard raised voices behind them. Pete was saying something about not right, what Dalton tried to do, and Johnson was agreeing. Even the workers who'd mocked her were apparently drawing a line at murder. Small comfort, but she'd take it. What now? Diego asked as they beached the skiff near where Becky's wagon waited. Becky thought about her father's carpentry shop in Philadelphia, about the skills she'd buried for 5 years, about Prince growing up watching her survive instead of thrive. Now, she said slowly, we figure out how to turn this partnership into something more permanent. Something that uses what we both know how to do. You have something in mind? Maybe, Becky said. But first, I need to get dry clothes and pick up my son. Then we talk about what comes next. Diego nodded. Fair enough. Where should I meet you? Becky surprised herself with her answer. My cabin. Tonight, after supper. We'll make plans. It was an invitation she never gave, a trust she never extended. But Diego had earned it today, in the cold water of the river, with his willingness to risk his life for hers. I'll be there, Diego said. As Becky drove her wagon back toward Helena, $4 in her pocket and a partnership forming that felt more real than anything had in years, she found herself thinking about possibilities instead of limitations. Maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to stop hiding what she could do. Maybe it was time to build something instead of just surviving. Maybe honest really was better than fancy. And maybe, just maybe, the cowboy with secrets and the woman with hidden gifts could create something neither of them could build alone. The night came soft over the valley, wrapping the hills in a slow hush of gold and gray. Diego rode steady through the tall grass, the smell of wet earth and pine rising with every step of his horse. The river whispered behind him, that same river that had nearly taken their lives hours ago. He'd seen courage before, men charging into gunfire, women crossing deserts with nothing but faith, but what Becky had done that day stayed with him. It wasn't loud courage. It was the kind that held its breath and kept working when no one else believed. When Diego reached her cabin, the lamp inside was already lit. The window glowed warm against the chill of the evening. For a long moment, he just sat there on his horse, staring at that square of light, wondering when he'd last been welcomed anywhere. Inside, Becky was finishing supper, simple stew, biscuits that were more determination than flour. Prince sat by the fire, tracing shapes in the dust with a stick. The boy looked up when he heard hoofbeats. "Mama, he's here," Prince said softly. Becky didn't answer right away. Her hand stilled over the pot, and she took a slow breath before saying, "Let him in." Diego stepped inside, hat in hand. The cabin was small but clean wood floors, neatly patched curtains, a Bible open on the table, a woman's strength in every corner. "Evening," he said. "Evening," Becky replied, nodding toward the chair across from her. "You hungry?" He smiled faintly. "Always." As they ate, silent, stretched, not uncomfortable, just full of the weight of people who'd had to measure every word for too long. When the boy finished, Becky sent him to bed with a kiss and a quiet prayer. Only then did she turn to Diego. "You said you knew people. Real work," she began. "What kind?" Diego leaned back, eyes on the fire. "Railroads. Mills. Ranches that pay honest wages if you can show results. But that's not what you want, is it?" She hesitated. "No. Not exactly." He waited. Becky rose and went to a small wooden chest near the wall. From it, she pulled a bundle wrapped in cloth, old tools, worn but cared for, a plane, a chisel, a square. She laid them gently on the table, as if unearthing a part of herself she'd buried too long. "My father taught me carpentry," she said quietly. Not sewing or cooking, building. Tables, doors, wheel spokes, even pieces for ships once. I stopped after my husband died. Diego nodded slowly. And now? Now I think maybe it's time to start again. There's a need in town. Folks are tired of hauling furniture all the way from St. Louis. I could make it here. But I'd need lumber, tools, a wagon that can carry weight. Diego's eyes softened. And you think we could make that happen? She met his gaze. You said you wanted honest work. This is as honest as it gets. For the first time that evening, Diego's grin reached his eyes. Then we start tomorrow. Becky frowned slightly. Tomorrow? You move fast, Mr. Lopez. He chuckled. When you've run from as many things as I have, you learn not to wait. Something flickered in her expression, curiosity mixed with a warning. You've got ghosts behind you. Don't we all? He said quietly. The fire cracked, filling the pause with its low heartbeat. I can handle ghosts, Becky said finally. As long as they don't bring trouble to my door. Diego nodded. Fair enough. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. Inside, two people who had spent too long surviving began to imagine something bigger, not love, not yet, but partnership. Trust, fragile as a candle flame, flickering against the dark. And as Diego left that night, Becky stood at the window, watching the silhouette of his horse fade into the trees. For the first time in years, she felt the ache of something she'd almost forgotten, hope mixed with fear. She whispered to herself, maybe honest really is better than fancy. Then she blew out the lamp. Perfect. Here's the continuation, deeply emotional, cinematic, and written in the same soft, reflective tone that fits a faceless YouTube narration. Each scene flows like a slow, visual story meant to pair with gentle western guitar, ambient wind, and nature sounds. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of morning that makes the air bite but the world feel clean. Mist still hugged the riverbank when Becky hitched the mule to her wagon. Her hands were steady now, her movements sure. For the first time in months, she wasn't heading out to beg for work, she was heading out to make it. Diego was already waiting near the edge of a logging camp, sitting on his horse like he'd been carved into the scenery. He lifted a hand in greeting, and she couldn't help but notice he looked different in daylight. Not softer, but clearer. The kind of man whose story you could feel, even if you didn't know it yet. You sure you're ready for this? He asked as she pulled the wagon alongside. Becky gave a small, tired smile. Wasn't I ready yesterday? He chuckled. Fair point. They drove upriver, to the fallen pines that had been left to rot what the company had abandoned as too crooked, too heavy, too much trouble. To Becky, though, it was a gold mine. This'll do, she said, hopping down from the wagon. She ran her fingers along one log, feeling the grain, the weight, the strength. These'll make fine table legs once they're dried properly. Diego helped her lift the smaller trunks, his muscles straining under the effort. You know, when I first saw you by that river, I didn't think of you as a carpenter. That's because people like me aren't supposed to be, Becky said, eyes still on the wood. We're supposed to clean and bow and say thank you for what's left. He looked at her for a long moment. Then maybe it's time we stop doing what we're supposed to. Her lips curved slightly. Maybe so. They worked in silence for hours, the steady rhythm of saw and breath filling the forest. Every strike of the axe felt like breaking free from hunger, from judgment, from the heavy quiet that had followed Becky for years. Around noon, they stopped to rest. Diego pulled a canteen from his thul bag and offered it. She drank, wiped her mouth, and said softly, "You said once someone helped you when they didn't have to. Who was it?" He was quiet for a long time, eyes fixed on the mountains. "A rancher down in Texas. A man named Boone. Took me in when the law was after me." Becky froze, watching him carefully. "After you?" Diego nodded, slow and unashamed. "Got into a fight. Sheriff's nephew. The boy didn't die, but the law didn't care much for details. I ran. I changed my name for a while." Becky studied him the way he said it, calm but hollow. "Have you ever thought about going back?" "No," he said. "Some places you leave for a reason. But helping you, maybe it's my way of making things right. Boone once told me, you don't fix your life by hiding from it, boy. You fix it by building something better." Becky looked down at her hands, scarred, calloused, and still capable. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," Diego said softly. "Cancer took him last winter. I never got to say thank you." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was gentle, the kind that only exists when two people understand the weight of loss without needing to name it. Later that day, as they loaded the last of the lumber, Becky caught Diego watching her again, not in the way men in town did, but like he was trying to memorize who she was when no one else was looking. "What?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. He shook his head. "Just thinking. You belong here not begging scraps, but running things. You've got the mind for it." Becky snorted softly. "The mind doesn't matter much to men like Dalton." "Then maybe it's time they answer to someone who's not like them," Diego said, tightening the last rope. Becky stared at him for a long moment. The words sank deep, settling somewhere she didn't know was empty until he filled it. "Let's get this back," she said, climbing onto the wagon. "We've got work to start." They rode back to her cabin under sky streaked in copperlight. The road was rough, but Becky didn't mind. Each bump, each jolt, felt like movement toward something that finally made sense. Prince ran out to meet them, barefoot and laughing, his small hands reaching for the horse. Diego dismounted and lifted the boy up with an ease that surprised them both. "Think he likes you," Becky said, hiding a smile. "Smart kid," Diego replied, grinning. "Takes after his mama." Becky turned away before he could see her cheeks flush, not from flattery, but from the unfamiliar warmth that came with being seen and not judged. That night, the first boards of their new workshop lay stacked under the eaves of her cabin. Becky stood there after Diego left, touching the wood like it was something sacred. It wasn't much yet, just lumber, a dream, and two tired souls trying to build a future. But for the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't surviving against the world. She was building it. And somewhere out there, Diego was riding through the dark, replaying the sound of her voice when she said, "Maybe so." He hadn't realized until that moment how long it had been since he believed in maybe. By the time a week passed, the sound of hammer and saw echoed daily from Becky's cabin. What used to be a lonely stretch of land near the river now rang with the rhythm of creation, steady, sure, defiant. Each morning, Becky tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and set to work beside Diego. She'd mark the cuts, he'd split the boards. She'd sand the pieces smooth, he'd haul them to the frame of what would soon become a workshop. By evening, their hands were raw, their shoulders sore, but there was something in that ache neither of them would trade for comfort. It was the ache of purpose. Word started to spread in town, the kind that travels on coffee steam and side-eye glances. Dalton's men muttered about the woman and the outlaw, about how she'd taken good lumber and was building something foolish. But behind closed doors, some of those same men whispered admiration. Because every day, Becky James was proving something they'd rather not admit, that she was better at their work than they were. One morning, Mrs. Henderson, the same woman who'd once pulled her daughter away from Prince, stopped her wagon on the road. She looked down at Becky with an expression half curious, half condescending. "I hear you're building furniture now," she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. Becky didn't look up from the board she was planning. "Building useful things. Yes, Mrs. Henderson sniffed. "And people are buying." "Not yet," Becky said evenly, "but they will." The woman's lips tightened. "Well, best of luck to you, I suppose. Not every venture works out, especially for your sort." Becky paused mid-stroke. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes steady but not cold. "My sort, Mrs. Henderson," she said quietly, "knows how to build something that lasts. Can't say the same for gossip." The other woman blinked, color rising in her cheeks. She snapped the reins and rode off without another word. Diego, who had been listening from the workshop doorway, let out a low whistle. "Remind me never to argue with you." Becky smiled faintly. "Then don't give me a reason to." They shared a laugh, brief, light, and genuine. It was a sound that had been missing from both their lives. That evening, the sky bruised purple over the mountains. Diego stayed later than usual, fixing the doorframe while Becky planned down the tabletop inside. "Tell me something," she said after a while, not looking up. "When you ran from Texas, did you ever think you'd end up here?" Diego leaned on his hammer, thinking. "I didn't think I'd end up anywhere. Thought I'd just keep moving till something caught me. And if it does?" He looked at her really. "Then I stop running." Becky met his gaze, saw the truth there, and nodded. "We all stop running sometime," she said. A long silence stretched between them, not awkward, but charged with a quiet recognition of two people standing at the edge of something fragile and real. Then came Prince's voice from the doorway. "Mama, look," he said, holding up a small wooden horse he'd carved from a scrap piece. Becky's eyes softened. She knelt beside him, running her fingers over the uneven surface. "That's good work, baby. Real good." Diego smiled. "You've got a craftsman right there." Prince beamed. "Can I help tomorrow?" Becky hesitated. "It's hard work." "I don't care," he said, puffing out his chest. She laughed quietly. "All right then. Tomorrow you learn how to sand." As the boy went back inside, Diego said, "He's got your spirit." Becky stared into the dark, her voice low. "He deserves better than my spirit. He deserves a world that doesn't treat him like he's already less." Diego's jaw tightened. "Then we'll build it." She turned toward him, surprised by the certainty in his tone. "You talk like it's that simple." He shrugged. "It isn't. But that's never stopped you before." The firelight flickered through the cabin window, painting gold across her face. For a moment, Diego wanted to say more about the way her strength steadied him, about how her silence said more than most people's words. But he didn't. Instead, he just said, "I'll see you at dawn." As he mounted his horse, Becky watched him disappear into the trees again, the sound of hooves fading into the hum of crickets. When she finally stepped inside, Prince was asleep on the floor beside the fire, the wooden horse still clutched in his hand. Becky bent, tucked a blanket around him, and sat back in the rocking chair. Her eyes wandered to the tools laid out neatly on the table. Her father's tools. She whispered softly to the dark, "We're building something, Papa. Something that matters." And in that quiet moment, under the steady rhythm of the rain beginning to fall, Becky James felt something she hadn't in years. Not just hope. Belonging. The rain came harder through the night, drumming against the roof like 1,000 restless fingers. Becky woke before dawn, as she always did, but this time it wasn't dread that pulled her from sleep, it was purpose. She dressed quietly, careful not to wake Prince, and stepped outside into the gray pre-dawn light. The air smelled of wet pine and fresh earth. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker started its morning work. Diego was already there, waiting by the lumber pile with 2 horses. He'd brought proper equipment, real cant hooks, rope that wasn't frayed, even a pair of leather gloves that looked almost new. "Thought you might need these," he said, holding out the gloves. Becky hesitated. Accepting help still felt like admitting defeat somehow, like confirming what everyone already believed about her. "They were my brothers," Diego added quietly. He'd want them used. The past tense wasn't lost on her. She took the gloves. "Thank you." They rode upriver in silence, the horses picking their way carefully along the muddy path. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached the jam, a massive tangle of logs wedged against a natural bottleneck in the river. The water churned around it, angry and dark. Becky's stomach tightened. She'd seen jams before, had even worked smaller ones, but this was different. The logs were huge, old-growth timber that must have broken free from somewhere upstream. They were stacked at chaotic angles, held together by pressure and water and sheer bad luck. One wrong move and the whole thing could let go, taking anyone nearby with it. "Dalton sent you here to die," Diego said flatly. "I know. So why are we here?" Becky dismounted, studying the jam with the same careful attention she gave everything. "Because if we don't do it, he'll find another way to get rid of me. And because..." She paused, her jaw set. "Because I'm tired of running from hard things." Diego understood that. He'd spent years running from Texas, from his past, from the man he used to be. Running never actually took you anywhere. It just made you a stranger to yourself. "All right then," he said. "But we do this smartly. My brother died doing something brave and stupid. I don't aim to repeat that." They worked through the morning, testing the logs, looking for the key pieces, the ones that held everything else in place. Diego had done this kind of work before, back when he'd had a different name and a different life. He showed Becky how to read the pressure points, how to feel which logs were weight-bearing and which were just caught in the chaos. She learned fast. Faster than he expected. Within an hour, she was spotting things he'd missed, suggesting approaches he hadn't considered. There was an engineer's mind behind those tired eyes, he realized. Someone had taught her to think in systems, in structures. "Who trained you?" he asked during a brief rest. Becky wiped sweat from her forehead, her eyes on the jam. "My father. He was a master carpenter in Virginia. Built churches, built homes, built things that lasted." Her voice softened. "He said every piece of wood has a story to tell, if you know how to listen." What happened to him? Same thing that happens to most black men who get too successful, too visible. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. They worked through the afternoon, repositioning ropes, using leverage instead of brute force, turning the jam's own weight against itself. It was dangerous, exhausting work. Twice, logs shifted unexpectedly, and they had to scramble back. Once, Becky's foot slipped on wet bark, and Diego caught her arm just before she went into the water. For a moment they stood there, his hand on her arm, both breathing hard, both aware of how close disaster had been. "Thank you," she said. "We're partners," he replied. "That's what partners do." Partners. The word hung in the air between them. When has anyone ever called her that? As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, they finally found the keystone log, the one piece that held everything together. It was wedged deep, but if they could move it just a few feet, the whole jam would break cleanly. "This is the dangerous part," Diego said. Becky nodded. She knew. Once that log moved, everything would move. They'd have seconds to get clear. They set up carefully, running ropes to solid anchor points on the shore, creating a path they could retreat along quickly. Diego positioned himself on the higher ground, Becky on the lower. It wasn't chivalry, it was strategy. She was lighter, faster, better at reading the wood's breaking points. "On 3, Diego called out. 1. Becky gripped the cant hook, her father's teachings running through her mind. "Listen to the wood. It will tell you when it's ready." 2. Diego pulled his rope taut, muscle straining. 3. They moved together, and for a moment nothing happened. Then a crack like thunder. The keystone log shifted, and suddenly the entire jam was in motion. Logs tumbling, water surging, the whole river reclaiming itself with violent joy. "Move!" Diego shouted. But Becky was already moving, her feet finding purchase on wet rocks, her hands grabbing the safety rope. Behind her, logs crashed and rolled, the sound deafening. She felt one graze her shoulder, spinning her around, but she kept going, kept climbing, until Diego's hand grabbed hers and pulled her up onto solid ground. They collapsed together on the muddy bank, breathing hard, as the river roared its approval. The jam was broken. The water ran clear and fast, carrying the logs downstream where they could be collected safely. They'd done it. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Diego started laughing, not from humor, but from the sheer improbability of being alive. Becky joined him, and soon they were both laughing like fools, covered in mud, exhausted, and somehow triumphant. "We did it," she said, wonder in her voice. "You did it," Diego corrected. "I just followed your lead." That night, back at the lumber camp, Dalton's face went through several interesting emotions when they reported the job done. Disbelief, anger, and finally, grudging respect, or the closest thing to it a man like him could manage. He paid them $2. Diego immediately split it, handing Becky her share. "Fair's fair," he said. But something had shifted. The other workers, who'd watched them leave that morning expecting to find their bodies by nightfall, now looked at Becky differently. Not with friendship yet, but with something close to acknowledgement. She was no longer invisible. As Diego rode with Becky back toward her cabin, the sun setting behind them, he said, "I meant what I said about finding you real work. I know some people building a new church in Helena. They need someone who understands structure, understands wood. It's not lumberyard wages, but it's steady. It's respected." Becky's throat tightened. "Why are you doing this?" Diego was quiet for a moment, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. "My brother, the one whose gloves you wore today, he was better than me in every way. Kinder, smarter, braver. When he died, I ran. Spent years hiding, being less than I was, letting fear make me small." He looked at her. "You don't hide. You don't make yourself small. Even when the world tries to break you, you just keep building. That's rare. That matters. Tears stung Becky's eyes, but she blinked them back. I'm not brave. I'm just out of options. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Diego said. It's doing what needs doing even when you're terrified. You've been doing that every day. When they reached her cabin, Prince was waiting outside, the wooden horse still in his hands. His face lit up when he saw his mother. Mama, did you break the big log jam? We did, baby. Both of you. Both of us. Prince looked up at Diego with something like awe. Are you staying for supper? Diego glanced at Becky, and she gave the smallest nod. I'd like that, he said. Inside the small cabin, over a simple meal of beans and cornbread, they talked. Diego told Prince stories about horses and mountains. Becky spoke about her father's work, the buildings he'd created. Prince fell asleep at the table, exhausted from his day of waiting and worrying. As Diego prepared to leave, Becky walked him to the door. Tomorrow, he said, we'll ride into Helena. I'll introduce you to the church builders. No promises, but I think they'll see what I see. What do you see? Becky asked, her voice barely a whisper. Diego met her eyes. Someone who builds things that last. Someone who turns hard work into something beautiful. He paused. Someone honest. That's rarer than fancy, and worth a hell of a lot more. After he'd gone, Becky stood in her doorway, watching the stars emerge one by one over the Montana sky. Her body ached. Her hands were raw despite the borrowed gloves. But inside, something had shifted. For years, she'd believed that survival meant making herself smaller, quieter, less visible. But maybe, just maybe, survival could mean something else. Maybe it could mean being seen, being valued, being a partner to someone who understood that strength came in many forms. She thought about tomorrow, about Helena, about the possibility of work that used her mind as well as her hands. She thought about Diego's words, I need honesty, not fancy. And for the first time since her father died, Becky James allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't just about enduring but about building something that would last. Something beautiful. Something true. The ride into Helena began in comfortable silence. Prince sat in front of Becky on her horse, chattering excitedly about everything he saw, a hawk circling overhead, wildflowers blooming along the trail, a family of deer disappearing into the trees. Diego rode alongside them, and Becky noticed how he'd shift his position whenever the trail narrowed or grew rough, always placing himself between them and potential danger. It wasn't showy or obvious. Just a present. The way her father used to be. Mr. Diego, Prince said suddenly, why do you help us? The question hung in the morning air. Even Becky found herself waiting for the answer, though she'd been too proud to ask it herself. Diego was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the trail ahead. Does your mama ever tell you about foundations, Prince? Like for houses? That's right. A house is only as strong as what it's built on. If the foundation's weak, it doesn't matter how fancy the rest is, the whole thing will come down eventually. He glanced at them. I spent a long time building my life on shaky ground. Lies, mostly. Pretending to be someone I wasn't. Running from who I was. Why'd you run? Prince asked with the uncomplicated directness of childhood. Because I was scared. And because it seemed easier than staying and fighting. Diego's jaw tightened. But running just made me lonelier. Made me forget what I was good for. Becky understood that loneliness. It was the kind that settled in your bones, that made you forget what your own laugh sounded like. Your mama reminded me of something, Diego continued, that there's strength in staying, in building on solid ground, even when the whole world's trying to wash you away. They crested a hill, and Helena spread out below them a town caught between wilderness and civilization, growing faster than it knew what to do with. Church spires rose above wooden buildings. Smoke curled from dozens of chimneys. In the distance, the mining operations scarred the mountainside. Becky's stomach tightened. The last time she'd come to Helena looking for work, she'd left with nothing but humiliation and $3 fewer than she'd started with. "They won't want me," she said quietly. Diego turned to look at her. "The church builders? Samuel and his crew? Any of them? Once they see." "See what?" "A skilled carpenter. Someone who understands structure better than most men they've worked with." Diego's voice was firm. "That's what they'll see because that's what I'll show them first." "And when will they see the rest?" "Then they'll have a choice," Diego said. "They can be fools and turn away the best craftsmen in the territory, or they can be smart and hire you." "You're assuming they're smart." "I'm assuming Samuel's practicality. He's building a church that needs to last through Montana winters. He can't afford to let prejudice make his walls weak." As they entered town, Becky felt the familiar weight of stares. White women pulling their children closer. Men's eyes traveled over her with expressions ranging from contempt to something worse. She'd learned to make herself smaller in these moments, to avoid eye contact, to become as invisible as possible. But Diego didn't change his pace or his bearing. He rode beside them like it was the most natural thing in the world: a white man, a black woman, and a child riding together through Helena's main street like they had every right to be there. Maybe they did. The church construction site was at the north end of town, on a hill overlooking the valley. It was much larger than Becky expected. The foundation was already laid, and wooden framing was beginning to take shape. But even from a distance, Becky could see problems. The corner joints were wrong. The weight distribution would never hold once they added the roof. Whoever had designed this had ambition but not enough understanding of load-bearing architecture. "It's going to collapse," she said without thinking. Diego smiled. That's what Samuel's starting to realize. He's had 3 different crews walk off the job after figuring out the original plans were flawed. They dismounted, and a man emerged from what looked like a temporary office, a lean, weathered white man in his 50s with carpenter's hands and intelligent eyes. This was Samuel. His gaze moved from Diego to Becky to Prince, and something flickered across his face. Not quite rejection, but not welcome either. Calculation. "Diego," he said carefully, "didn't expect to see you today. Samuel wanted to introduce you to someone." Diego gestured to Becky. "This is Rebecca James. Best carpenter I've seen in 20 years. Samuel's eyebrows rose. "Is that so?" "Your northeast corner's off by 3 degrees, Becky said before she could stop herself. "And your center supports won't hold the roof weight you're planning. You'll need to reinforce the foundation or redesign the roofline." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Samuel stared at her, his expression unreadable. Several of his workers had stopped what they were doing to watch. "And you know how?" Samuel finally asked. "My father was a master carpenter in Richmond. The First Baptist Church on Clay Street stood through the war, through fires, through everything." Becky met his eyes. "He taught me to see structure the way some people see color or music. It's not about muscle, Mr. Samuel. It's about understanding how forces work, Howard wants to move, how to make all the pieces talk to each other right. That church in Richmond, Samuel said slowly. I've heard of it. Beautiful work. My father believed beautiful should also be true. That honest craftsmanship mattered more than decoration. Samuel walked to the corner she'd mentioned, studying it. Then he pulled out a level, checked it, and cursed softly. She's right. 3¼ degrees off. He turned back to Becky. Can you fix this? I can fix all of it. But I'll need to see your full plans first, and understand what you're trying to build. What I'm trying to build is a church that'll stand for 100 years and hold 200 people on a Sunday. Samuel's voice was gruff. You think you can help with that? Becky thought about her father's hands guiding hers over wood grain. She thought about every humiliation she'd endured at the lumber yard. She thought about Prince watching from the wagon, learning what his mother was capable of. Yes, sir, I do. Samuel looked at Diego. You vouch for her? With my life. Another long silence. Then Samuel sighed. All right. But I got conditions. First, you work a trial week. No pay, but I feed you and the boy. If your work's as good as you say, then we talk wages. He paused. Second, some of my crew ain't going to like this. I can't control what they say, but I won't tolerate anyone interfering with the work. You'll have to handle the rest yourself. It wasn't fair. It wasn't even close to fair. But it was a chance. Third condition, Becky said before Samuel could continue. He blinked, surprised. You're making conditions. Yes, sir. If I prove my worth this week, I get the same wage as your other carpenters. Not half, not 3/4. The same. And my name goes on the dedication plaque when this church is finished. Samuel's workers were muttering now, but Becky kept her eyes on Samuel. She'd spent too long accepting scraps. If this was going to work, it had to be built on solid ground. That's asking a lot, Samuel said. I'm offering a lot. A church that'll stand for 100 years, like you want. Plans that'll work instead of ones that'll collapse. Becky's voice was steady. I know what I'm worth, Mr. Samuel. The question is whether you're practical enough to see it. Diego bit back a smile. She'd used his own words, practical over prejudice. Samuel studied her for what felt like an eternity. Then he stuck out his hand. 1 week. You prove you're as good as you claim, and we got a deal. Same wages, name on the plaque, the whole thing. Becky shook his hand, her grip firm and sure. But if you waste my time, Samuel added, you're gone, and you don't come back. Fair. Fair. As Samuel returned to his office to retrieve the plans, one of the workers, a stocky man with a thick beard, stepped forward. This is foolish, Sam, he called out. We have enough problems without adding complications. The complication, Roy, is that this building's going to fall down if we keep going the way we are, Samuel shot back. Unless you got better ideas. Roy glared at Becky but said nothing. Diego leaned close to her. Are you sure about this? No, Becky whispered. But I'm tired of being sure and still having nothing. Maybe it's time to try something different. Samuel returned with the plans, large sheets covered in careful drawings and measurements. He spread them on a makeshift table, and Becky leaned over them, her eyes moving quickly across the lines. She could see it all, the architect's vision, the mathematical errors, the places where theory had ignored the reality of wood and weight and Montana weather. Her fingers traced the problems, and in her mind, solutions began forming. "Here," she said, pointing. "And here. These 3 places are your main issues. Fix these, and everything else can work. Can you draw the corrections? Give me an hour and a pencil." Samuel handed her both, along with fresh paper. Becky sat down at the table, Prince standing quietly beside her, watching his mother work with wide eyes. Diego stood back, arms crossed, watching the workers watch her. Some were curious. Some were hostile. But all of them were watching. As Becky's pencil moved across the paper, confident and sure, something shifted in the air. This wasn't a woman desperate for scraps. This was a craftsman who knew her trade, making the kind of careful, precise marks that spoke of real training and real skill. At. An hour later, she pushed back from the table. "This'll work." Samuel examined her drawings, comparing them to the originals. His expression changed from skepticism to concentration to something like respect. "This is good work," he said quietly. "Real good. My father taught me well." "Yeah, he did." Samuel looked up at her. "All right, Rebecca James. You start tomorrow morning. Bring your tools, the good ones, not the lumberyard garbage. We build this right or we don't build it at all." As they left the construction site, Prince was practically bouncing. "Mama, you're going to build a church." "Maybe, baby. Let's see how the week goes first." But there was lightness in her voice that hadn't been there in months. Hope that wasn't just wishful thinking but based on something real. Her skill, her knowledge, her worth proven by work rather than given by charity. Diego walked them back to where their horses were tied. "You handled Samuel well. The conditions were smart." "I learned something from you," Becky said. "That sometimes you have to show people what you need, not just ask for it." "Still," Diego said, his voice serious, "this week's going to be hard. Roy and some of the others, they're going to test you." "I know. And if it gets to be too much." "It won't," Becky interrupted gently. "Because I'm not doing this alone anymore, am I?" Diego met her eyes, and something unspoken passed between them. Partnership. Trust. The beginning of something neither of them quite had words for yet. "No," he said. "You're not alone." As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple, they rode back toward Becky's cabin. Prince fell asleep against his mother's chest, exhausted from the long day. "Diego," Becky said quietly. "Yeah." "That foundation you talked about, the one you built on shaky ground." She paused. "I think maybe we're both building new ones now. Together." Diego didn't answer with words. He just nodded, and in that gesture was a promise that whatever came next, they'd face it side by side. Because some things were worth building carefully, worth taking time with, worth doing right. And this partnership, this friendship, this fragile beginning of trust between two people the world had tried to break, this was worth building to last. 6 months later, the church stood complete. It rose from the Helena hillside like a promise kept, strong walls of Montana timber, a steeple that caught the morning light, windows that would glow warm on winter evenings. Every joint was true. Every beam was solid. Every corner spoke of work done right by hands that understood what they were building. Rebecca James stood in the empty sanctuary, running her hand along a pew she'd helped craft. The wood was smooth under her fingers. Each plank fitted so precisely you could barely see the seams. Her father would have been proud. "Mama," Come look. Prince's voice echoed from the front of the church. He stood by the dedication plaque, freshly mounted beside the door. Becky walked down the center aisle, her footsteps the only sound in the sacred quiet. There, carved in brass, were the names of everyone who'd built this place. Samuel Morrison, master builder Diego Lopez, foreman Rebecca James, lead carpenter. Her name. Not hidden. Not diminished. Just there, solid and permanent as the building itself. That's you, Mama, Prince whispered, tracing the letters with his small finger. Everyone's going to see it. Forever. Becky's throat tightened. She thought about the lumber yard, about Dalton's cruel smile, about standing in mud while men laughed at her desperation. She thought about every time she'd been invisible, every door that had closed, every time she'd been told she wasn't enough. And then she thought about Diego's hand reaching out beside a river. About Samuel giving her a chance when he didn't have to. About the way her own determination had refused to let the world's cruelty make her small. Rebecca. She turned. Diego stood in the doorway, backlit by afternoon sun. 6 months of working together had changed them both. His shoulders didn't carry quite so much weight anymore. His eyes had lost some of their haunted quality. He'd stopped running from his past and started building a future instead. And she'd learned that being seen wasn't the same as being vulnerable. That asking for help wasn't a weakness. That partnership could mean sharing both the work and the worthiness. Service starts in an hour, Diego said. You ready? The first Sunday service. The whole town would come to everyone who'd ignored her, dismissed her, crossed the street to avoid her. They'd come to this church she'd built, sit in pews her hands had crafted, pray beneath a roof she'd engineered to stand for generations. I'm ready, she said. Diego walked down the aisle toward her, his boots echoing in the empty space. When he reached her, he didn't say anything for a moment. Just stood there, looking at the plaque, at her name carved in brass. Your father would be proud, he said quietly. I know. Becky's voice wavered. I just wish he could see it. Maybe he can. Diego gestured around them. This place, it's not just wood and nails, Rebecca. It's proof. Proof that skill matters more than prejudice. That truth outlasts lies. That people like us, people the world tried to erase, we can build things that last. People like us. Diego's jaw tightened. I told you I was running from Texas. From my past. He paused. My real name's Diego Alejandro Martinez Lopez. My family owned good land. Until the Rangers decided Mexican families didn't deserve property, didn't deserve protection, didn't deserve anything but being driven out or killed. His voice hardened. My brother tried to fight back legally, through the courts. They shot him on the courthouse steps and called it resisting arrest. Becky's hand found his. So I ran, Diego continued. Changed my name, hid who I was, spent years trying to be invisible enough to survive. And then I watched you refuse to be invisible, and I remembered we don't honor the people we've lost by hiding. We honor them by building something better. Before Becky could respond, voices drifted in from outside. The congregation was arriving. Samuel appeared in the doorway. It's time, he said. Then, quieter, thank you, Rebecca, for saving this project. For teaching an old man that pride makes a poor foundation. Over the past 6 months, Samuel had become more than an employer. He'd become a mentor, a friend, someone who'd chosen to be better than his prejudices. He defended her to the church board. He'd paid her fairly. He'd made sure everyone knew that this building stood because of her skill. "Thank you for the chance," Becky said. "Wasn't charity. It was good business." Samuel's eyes twinkled. "Besides, I have another project starting next month. Hospital over in Butte. I'm going to need a good foreman." He looked at Diego, then back to Becky. "Thought maybe you two might be interested. If you're staying partners, that is." Becky and Diego exchanged a glance. In 6 months, they'd moved from awkward allies to something deeper, a friendship built on mutual respect, shared struggle, and the simple miracle of being truly seen. "We're staying partners," Diego said. "Good," Samuel nodded. "Then let's show these folks what honest work looks like." The congregation filed in slowly. White families in their Sunday best. Black families who'd traveled from across the territory. Mexican workers who'd helped with construction. Chinese laborists from the mining camps. Even some Salish people from the nearby reservation. Helena was changing. Montana was changing. Not fast enough, not easily, but changing nonetheless. And this church, this building that had required everyone to work together, to value skill over skin color, to choose substance over prejudice, stood as proof that change was possible. Roy, the worker who'd protested loudest when Becky was hired, sat near the back. He'd never apologized, never said he was wrong. But 2 months into construction, he'd started asking her advice on difficult joints. By the 4th month, he was defending her to newcomers who questioned her presence. He still wasn't friendly, might never be. But he'd learned respect, and sometimes that was enough. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who jerked her daughter away from Prince at the general store, sat in the 3rd row. Her daughter waved shyly at Prince, who waved back. Small moments. Small changes. But real ones. As the service began, Becky sat with Prince on one side and Diego on the other. The Reverend spoke about community, about building together, about second chances. "This church," he said, his voice carrying through the space Becky had designed for perfect acoustics, "was built by people who understood that every soul has worth. That talent knows no color. That God's grace falls on all of us equally, whether we deserve it or not." He gestured to the plaque by the door. "The names you see there are the names of people who refused to let this community's prejudices become its prison. Who insisted that we could be better. Who proved that when we value skill over suspicion, truth over tradition, we build something that lasts." Becky felt tears slip down her cheeks. Prince squeezed her hand. "You did it, Mama," he whispered. "You built something beautiful." After the service, people lingered, some to admire the craftsmanship, some to speak to Samuel, a few even to approach Becky directly. Not all were kind, but more were curious than cruel, and that was progress. An elderly black woman touched Becky's arm. "My granddaughter saw your name on that plaque," she said softly. "Asked me if women could be carpenters. I told her that with your hands and the Lord's blessing, you could be anything." Tears shone in her eyes. "Thank you for showing her that." A young Mexican boy approached Diego shyly. "My papa says you're from Texas. That you came here to start over." "That's right," Diego said. "I want to start over too. I want to learn building, like you." The boy's eyes were bright with hope. Would you teach me?" Diego looked at the boy who saw himself years ago, full of dreams before the world had tried to crush them, and nodded. "Come to the construction site tomorrow. We'll start with foundations. That's where everything good begins." As the crowd thinned, Becky walked outside to the small cemetery beside the church. She'd requested this spot specifically, and had even supervised the stone carving herself. The marker was simple. In memory of master carpenter James Thomas Virginia 1820–1880, who taught his daughter that honest work builds more than buildings. I kept my promise, Papa, Becky whispered. Build something that matters. Something that'll last. A hand touched her shoulder. Diego stood beside her, understanding in his silence. My brother's buried in Texas, he said. I can't visit him. But I think I hope he'd be proud too. Proud that I stopped running. Started building. They stood there together as the sun painted the mountains gold. Two people who'd survived by hiding, learning to live by being seen. The church bells rang out across the valley clear, strong, and permanent. Prince ran up, breathless and grinning. Mama. Mr. Samuel says there's going to be a school next year. Says maybe I could go. His joy was incandescent. A real school, Mama. Becky pulled him close, kissing the top of his head. 6 months ago, she'd stood by a river with empty pockets and a heart full of fear, accepting impossible work because any chance was better than none. Now she stood beside a church she'd built, with a future that felt possible and a child who'd seen his mother prove that skill and determination could overcome prejudice. Not easily. Not completely. But enough. You're going to that school, she promised. Going to learn everything they can teach you and more. Will you still build churches? Churches, hospitals, homes, whatever needs building. She looked at Diego. We'll build things that last. Things that matter, Diego added. As they walked back toward their horses, Prince between them chattering about everything he'd learned that day, Becky felt something she'd stopped believing in years ago. Not just hope. Not just belonging. Peace. The kind of peace that came from knowing you'd faced the worst and survived. From knowing your worth wasn't determined by others' blindness. From knowing that somewhere in this hard territory, you'd found people who saw you, really saw you, and valued what they found. 6 months ago, she told a cowboy she wasn't beautiful, wasn't fancy, wasn't the kind of woman people helped. He replied, "Fine by me. I need to be honest, not fancy." And with those words, everything had changed. Not because he'd saved her, she'd saved herself 1,000 times over. But because he'd been willing to see her when the rest of the world looked away. Because he'd offered partnership instead of charity. Because he'd understood that sometimes the strongest foundations are built between people who refuse to let the world make them small. The church stood behind them, solid and true. Tomorrow they'd ride to Butte, begin planning the hospital. There would be more challenges, more prejudice, more people who try to make them invisible. But they'd face it together, building one honest project at a time, proving with every beam and joint and carefully fitted corner that skill mattered, truth endured, and people who refused to hide their worth could change the world one building at a time. As they mounted their horses and turned toward home, the setting sun caught the church steeple, making it glow like a beacon. And carved in brass beside the door, catching the last rays of light, 3 names stood as testament. Samuel Morrison, Diego Lopez, Rebecca James. Builders. Partners. Friends. Proof that sometimes the most beautiful things in life aren't fancy at all. They're honest. They're true. They're built to last. And they change everything. The end. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as you can ever imagine. Drop a comment, hit the like button, and subscribe for more stories that remind us the heart's still the strongest thing we've got.